The box slipped from my trembling hands and hit the cold concrete floor with a hollow, cracking sound, the kind that feels like your heart just shattering inside your chest. It was such a small noise, yet it tore through the silence of the garage, like a verdict being read aloud, sentencing a marriage I once believed was unbreakable. In the dim light filtering through the door, I saw it lying there, a small, perfectly sealed box of condoms, gleaming, untouched, and cruelly out of place. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it meant. At that moment I realized what had fallen wasn't just a box. It was every ounce of trust I'd ever placed in the man named Cole. My marriage died in silence. There were no screams, no tears, no confrontation, only a suffocating stillness, heavy enough to make me hear my own heartbeat breaking, one pulse at a time. My name is Mara Bennett, and until this morning, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. My husband, Adrian Cole, was the kind of man other women admired. Calm, successful, gentle, a man who made me feel safe. We had what everyone called the perfect life. A cozy suburban home, a sunlit garden, and quiet mornings that always began with a cup of coffee he made for me. Every day, he'd leave in his charcoal gray suit, smelling of his favorite cologne, kissing my forehead before heading out the door. I can still picture that look. Warm, steady, flawless. To everyone else, we were the couple people envied. No jealousy, no fights, no raised voices. And I believed that peace was proof of love. But now I know. Sometimes peace is just the disguise of a storm waiting to break. That morning, after he left for work, I decided to do something thoughtful. Clean the old SUV parked in the garage, the weekend car he barely used anymore. I thought it would make him smile, a small reminder that I still cared about the little things between us. I opened the garage door. The air was cold, heavy with dust, and the smell of old oil. I turned on the light, humming softly as I wiped down the dashboard, imagining his reaction when he saw the car shining again. Then I opened the glove compartment. A simple, thoughtless gesture. But it was enough to collapse my entire world. There, wedged between registration papers and crumpled receipts, sat a brand new box of condoms, neatly placed as if hidden on purpose. For a second, time froze. My hands shook. My breath caught in my throat. A chill spread through my chest. We hadn't used protection in years, not since we tried for our second child. So why? I forced myself to think logically. Maybe it was old, maybe forgotten, maybe not his at all. But logic stayed silent, and instinct whispered the only truth I couldn't deny. He had betrayed me. I stood there motionless, surrounded by dust and dim light, holding that tiny box like evidence from a crime scene. And in that instant I knew. Nothing about my life would ever be the same again. I stayed there for a long time, motionless, as if moving would make it all more real. The sunlight creeping through the small garage window had turned pale, dust swirling in its beam like silent witnesses to my humiliation. The box was still on the floor. I couldn't pick it up again. It felt radioactive, an object so charged with truth that touching it twice would burn my skin. I whispered to myself, there has to be an explanation. Maybe it wasn't his. Maybe someone borrowed the car. Maybe it was old. But even as I said it, the words rang hollow, like lies echoing inside an empty house. I forced myself to finish cleaning. Each stroke of the rag across the dashboard felt mechanical, robotic, as if pretending everything was normal could somehow make it normal again. But my thoughts were spiraling, slipping between denial and rage. By the time I locked the garage, my body felt weightless, detached from my own life. I walked into the house, poured myself a glass of water, and sat on the kitchen floor. The water trembled in my hand. That was when I realized something crucial. The pain wasn't only from betrayal, it was from the loss of certainty. For the first time in years, I no longer knew who my husband really was. That evening, Adrian came home at the usual hour, carrying the same tired briefcase, the same faint smell of cologne. He kissed my cheek, hung his coat, and asked, "How was your day, sweetheart?" I stared at him for a second too long before answering. Quiet. He smiled, opened the fridge, and began talking about work. A new project, a meeting, a client. His voice was calm, smooth, practiced. I watched his lips move, his gestures, the rhythm of his words. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same. At dinner, he laughed about something his colleague Brooke had said that day. I remembered her, the woman with perfect hair and a laugh that lingered too long. The name cut through me like a paper blade. I forced a smile and said, "You seem to enjoy her company." He chuckled. "Brooke, she's harmless. She talks too much." Then he changed the subject. But I noticed the faint hesitation before he did, the smallest pause invisible to anyone else. I stored it away like evidence. That night, I lay awake beside him. His breathing was slow, steady, peaceful. Mine wasn't. I studied the curve of his back, the hand resting on the pillow, and wondered how many times that same hand had touched another woman. My chest burned, but I didn't move. I had never felt more alone, lying inches away from the man I thought I knew best. The next morning, I decided to test him, gently, invisibly. Over breakfast, I said, "I thought of cleaning the SUV yesterday. Maybe we should take it for a drive this weekend." He froze for half a heartbeat, then forced a casual nod. "Sure, if I'm not too busy." That micro-pause told me everything. When he left, I sat by the window and watched his car disappear down the street. He didn't look back this time. That week, I became an observer in my own life. I watched his patterns like a scientist studying a specimen. The way he started taking longer showers before leaving for work, the new cologne, too strong, too unfamiliar, the sudden overtime meetings that had never existed before. His phone, once left on the counter, was now always face down, silent, guarded like a secret. I said nothing, because silence, I realized, could be sharper than confrontation. Each night I replayed the day in my mind, connecting fragments, a forgotten receipt in his pocket, a faint lipstick mark on a paper napkin, a text notification that flashed for 1 second before he swiped it away. Everything fit into a picture I didn't want to see but could no longer ignore. One evening, as he showered, I opened the laundry basket to gather towels. That's when I found it, a receipt from a hotel bar. 2 glasses of wine, 1 appetizer, no dinner, no date. Just something rushed and intimate. The timestamp, Tuesday night. The same night he told me he had stayed late for a presentation. My hands trembled as I held the paper. The edges were damp, wrinkled, but the ink was clear. I slipped it into my pocket, folded once, carefully, like a keepsake of heartbreak. When he stepped out of the shower, towel around his waist, steam trailing behind him, I looked at him. Really looked. The man standing before me was still handsome, still the husband I once adored, but his eyes avoided mine for half a second too long. That half second was all it took for me to know. That night, while he slept, I sat in the living room with the lights off. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, rhythmic and mocking. I stared at the box I'd retrieved from the garage earlier, now sitting on the coffee table in front of me. It looked harmless again, just cardboard and plastic. But I knew better. That little box had changed everything. For hours, I sat there thinking, not about revenge, not yet, but about how fragile trust truly was. How love could rot quietly while you're busy believing it's growing. I thought about every "I love you" he'd said in that calm, steady tone. Had he lied then too? Or did he believe it the way liars sometimes do? Sometime past midnight, I made a decision. If he was going to destroy the life we built, he wouldn't do it unscathed. I would find out the truth, all of it, and I would decide what to do when the time was right. From that night on, I stopped being the wife he knew. I smiled when he came home late. I asked nothing, demanded nothing. I became calm, composed, untouchable, a mirror reflecting his lies back at him. And behind that calm, something colder began to grow. Days turned into weeks, and the mask I wore began to fit so perfectly, even I started believing it. I woke up beside him, smiled when he kissed my cheek, laughed when he made jokes over dinner. To anyone watching, I was the same woman, devoted, patient, calm. But beneath that still surface, something dark was taking shape. Not madness, not hysteria, precision. Every lie he told became a thread, and I collected them one by one, weaving a quiet tapestry of truth only I could see. He thought I was blind. He didn't know I had already begun seeing everything. Adrian started leaving earlier for work. Early meetings, he said. He came home later, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, something sharp and floral, clinging to his collar like a confession. Sometimes he showered twice before bed, claiming stress, exhaustion. He never noticed how my eyes followed every movement, every hesitation. One Thursday evening, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up for a split second. Enough for me to see the name, Brooke Lang. No last name needed. I knew who she was, The woman he mentioned casually, the harmless colleague, the one with the rehearsed laugh and perfect hair. The air left my lungs. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. The truth was already there, glowing in that single notification. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the reflection of the bathroom light under the door. Water was running. He was humming softly, and in that melody I heard the sound of my last illusions dying. When he came out, towel around his waist, I smiled and said, "Who's texting this late?" He looked at the phone, hesitated, then shrugged. "Work stuff. You know how it is." I nodded, eyes gentle, voice steady. "Of course, honey. I trust you." He smiled, relieved, unsuspecting. He had no idea that his wife had just made a silent vow. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen, the cold tiles grounding me in the moment. Outside, rain drummed against the windows. I opened a drawer, searching for something I hadn't used in years, latex gloves, cleaning supplies. And then my eyes fell on a small jar tucked behind a box of spices. Dried habanero chili peppers. The hottest ones money could buy. Adrian once joked that he couldn't handle anything spicier than ketchup. How fitting, I thought. I placed the jar on the counter. The glass glinted under the dim light like a weapon disguised as innocence. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it, breathing. Every muscle in my body was calm, my heart beat steady. It wasn't fury anymore, it was clarity. He had taken from me something sacred, and now I would take something from him in return. I began my work carefully, methodically, crushing the peppers into a fine orange-red powder that burned my throat just from the scent. I wore gloves, my hands steady as I sifted the dust, letting the sting remind me of every lie I had swallowed. When it was done, I opened the box I had retrieved from the garage, the box that had started it all. There were 4 condoms inside, all new, all sealed. I picked one up, feeling the smooth plastic between my fingers, and whispered, "You shouldn't have lied to me, Adrian." One by one, I unsealed them just enough to coat the insides with the infernal dust, then sealed them again with surgical precision. No marks, no signs of tampering, each one a promise, silent, fiery, inevitable. When I finished, I placed them back exactly where I'd found them, in the same glove compartment, in the same position, as if nothing had ever happened. Then I stood there in the dim garage light, my reflection staring back from the car window. I didn't recognize the woman looking at me. Her eyes were calm, cold, almost merciful, and yet there was something terrifyingly free in them. The next morning, I woke early and made breakfast. Eggs, toast, his favorite black coffee. I hummed softly, the same tune I'd hummed the day I found the box. When he came into the kitchen adjusting his tie, I smiled. "Early meeting?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, might be late tonight." I reached out, smoothed his collar, kissed his cheek. "Don't worry," I said. "Take your time." He smiled, grateful, unsuspecting. When he left, I stood by the window watching him drive away, the same way I had done countless times before. But this time there was no ache, no sadness, only quiet anticipation. Hours passed. Afternoon sunlight slid across the kitchen tiles, long and golden. I moved through the house like a ghost, silent, waiting. By evening, the call came. An unfamiliar number flashed on my screen. I hesitated, then answered. On the other end was chaos. A woman's voice, frantic, sobbing. "Mara, it's Brooke K. Something's wrong with Adrian. He's in pain. I don't know what's happening." My pulse slowed. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice perfectly even. He was fine, and then suddenly he started screaming, saying, it burns everywhere." Her words broke into hysterical crying. I could almost see it. Adrian doubled over, agony written across his face, the fire spreading through his body. Justice, poetic and searing. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then I whispered, softly, "You should call an ambulance," and hung up. I stood there, phone still in my hand, listening to the silence that followed. It was strange. There was no satisfaction, no guilt, only peace. For the first time in months, I felt in control. Later that night, as rain began to fall again, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The house was quiet. The storm outside was mine. I took a slow sip and whispered to myself, "Now you know how it feels, Adrian." The clock ticked, steady and slow. And somewhere in a sterile hospital room filled with confusion and whispered questions, karma was doing its job, perfectly, precisely, mercilessly. The next morning began like any other, except it wasn't. The air inside the house felt lighter, almost translucent, as if the weight I'd carried for months had finally lifted. I made coffee, listening to the faint hiss of the machine, watching steam curl upward like ghosts leaving my body. By noon, my phone was flooded with messages I didn't answer. I knew what they were before I opened them. Whispers spread faster than truth. By evening, the story had already begun weaving itself through the city. In the hallways of Halcyon and Rowe, the firm where Adrian worked, in coffee shops, and in the private group chats of bored colleagues who thrived on gossip. Someone had seen him at the emergency room the night before, stumbling in, red-faced, half-dressed, screaming that he was on fire. Someone else said the nurse had to keep a straight face while he begged for painkillers. And by the end of the day, the tale had mutated into something grotesque and hilarious, a tragic comedy that no one could resist retelling. They called it the Chili Incident. At home, I sat on the couch, my hands wrapped around a warm mug, the news playing in my mind like a distant movie. I could imagine the scene vividly, the sterile white light of the hospital, the confused doctors, the whispers behind the curtain, the sideways glances. And in the middle of it all, Adrian Cole, the man who once commanded a room with his confidence, now reduced to a trembling wreck of shame and agony. I didn't smile. There was nothing funny about it. Revenge isn't laughter, it's silence that no longer hurts. Later that day, he came home. I heard the car pull into the driveway, the hesitant sound of the door opening, then closing. He walked in slowly, avoiding my eyes. He looked smaller somehow, like the world had drained the arrogance out of him. His skin was pale, his movements stiff. "Mara," he said softly. I turned from the sink, wiping my hands. "Yes?" He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "There's been an accident." I let the silence linger. "An accident," I repeated, pretending to think. "At work?" His gaze faltered. "Sort of. Reaction. I'm not sure how it happened." I murmured, drying my hands carefully. "You should be more careful, Adrian." He stared at me, eyes searching, confused. For a second, I thought he might see the truth reflected in mine. But he didn't. He was too busy drowning in his own humiliation. That night, he barely touched his dinner. The air between us was so heavy it could have shattered glass. When he excused himself and went to bed early, I stayed in the kitchen, sipping my wine, listening to the quiet rhythm of the clock. It wasn't peace. It was aftermath. By the end of the week, everyone at Halcyon and Rowe knew. They whispered in hallways, smirked behind screens, their sympathy barely hiding amusement. Some said he'd been poisoned. Others claimed it was karma. No one knew the details, but they all knew who had been with him. Brooke Lang, she stopped showing up to the office altogether. Rumor had it she was hiding, sick, humiliated, her marriage collapsing. Her husband Daniel had discovered everything. Someone had sent him a copy of the hospital report. Someone anonymous. Adrian, meanwhile, tried to pretend it was all behind him. He avoided eye contact with colleagues, ignored the laughter, worked late, and came home smelling of anxiety. His confidence, once his armor, was gone. And every time I looked at him, I saw not the man I'd loved, but the ghost of what he'd chosen to become. A week later, his boss called him into a private meeting. I knew before he told me. He came home that night with a look I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, just pure defeat. "They let me go," he said simply. I set down my glass of water, calm as ever. "I see. They said it was conduct unbecoming, damage to the company's image." His voice cracked on the last word. I could feel him waiting for sympathy, for a kind word, for forgiveness. But I had none left to give. He rubbed his face, muttering, "Everything's falling apart." And for the first time, I didn't rush to comfort him. I just nodded. "Yes, Adrian, it is." In the following days, he tried to act normal, cooking dinner, cleaning, talking about job applications. But every gesture felt desperate, forced, hollow. He no longer filled the house with his presence. He haunted it. At night, I would hear him pacing in the living room, whispering to himself, sometimes crying quietly when he thought I was asleep. Once I saw him standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, touching his face as if searching for the man he used to be. There was none left. Meanwhile, my silence had become his punishment. He couldn't bear it. Every gentle tone, every polite word from me sliced deeper than any shout could have. "Mara," he said one night, breaking under the weight of it. "I'm sorry." I looked at him calmly. "For what exactly?" "For everything." He waited for my reaction. I gave him none. because there was nothing left to save. He broke down, tears streaming, whispering apologies that came too late. I let him cry. I let him feel every ounce of the pain he'd built with his own hands. Days later, I printed the divorce papers. It wasn't revenge anymore, it was release. I placed them on the dining table, next to a pen and a folded envelope containing the bank statements I'd uncovered. Proof of the money he had spent on Brooke. Dinners, hotels, gifts, all paid for with our joint account. When he came home that evening and saw the papers, he froze. He didn't ask why. He knew. He sat down, his hand trembling as he reached for the pen. And for the first time in months, he met my eyes. There was no defiance left in him, only acceptance. Without a word, he signed. As the pen touched paper, I felt something inside me unclench. The tightness that had gripped my chest for so long finally releasing. It wasn't joy, it wasn't sorrow, it was peace. That night, I packed a suitcase. Just the essentials: clothes, documents, the children's photos, and one last look at the house that had witnessed both love and ruin. Before leaving, I walked to the garage one final time. The car sat there, silent and gleaming in the faint light. The glove compartment was empty now. Justice had been served, quietly, completely. I closed the door and whispered to the darkness, "It's over." When I stepped outside, the night air was cold but clean. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something that almost resembled freedom. I wasn't the same woman who had found that box weeks ago. That woman had died in the silence of a garage. The one walking away now, she was someone reborn. The apartment was small, but it was mine. No scent of cologne clung to the curtains, no half-finished coffee cups left behind, no faint echoes of lies bouncing off the walls. Just silence, a pure, unbroken kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. At first, it was strange waking up alone. The bed felt enormous, the mornings too quiet. But little by little, I began to realize that the absence of someone could feel lighter than their presence. I started to fill the space again. With music, the smell of cinnamon candles, and the sound of my own laughter. I was learning to exist without the shadow of a man beside me. The first week after the divorce felt like detoxing from a life I'd mistaken for love. I slept badly, cried unexpectedly, and sometimes caught myself setting 2 plates for breakfast out of habit. But with each passing day, the ghost of that old life faded a little more. Healing, I discovered, isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to keep breathing, even when it still hurts. One afternoon, while organizing my email, I noticed a new message. Short, polite, from a name that made me freeze. Daniel Hawthorne, Brooke's husband. He'd written, "Mara, I know this is strange. I just wanted to say I understand more than I ever wanted to. If you ever feel like talking, even just about nothing at all, I'm here. No judgment." I read it 3 times. My first instinct was to delete it, to shut that door before it even opened. But something in his words stopped me. They weren't dramatic. They weren't pity. Just honest. For days, I didn't reply. Then one evening, I found myself typing without thinking. "Thank you. I think we both know what it's like to lose the same illusion." He responded within minutes. And just like that, a quiet correspondence began. Not about revenge, not about pain, but about understanding. We met 2 weeks later at Centennial Park under a gray, forgiving sky. The trees were shedding the last of their leaves, the air smelled of damp earth and change. When I saw him walking toward me, I almost turned away. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just more real. There was grief in the lines of his face, but also a strange calmness, like someone who'd already walked through fire and found the other side. "Mara," he said softly, offering a polite, unsure smile. "Daniel," I nodded, shaking his hand. His grip was warm, grounding. We sat on a bench overlooking the pond. For a long while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was necessary. 2 people who had lived the same tragedy from different sides of the same lie. Finally, he said, "I kept asking myself what I did wrong." I smiled faintly, looking at the water. "So did I." "Did you find an answer?" he asked. "Yes," I said quietly. "I married a man who looked like safety but was really an earthquake." He chuckled softly. A sad, broken sound that turned into something genuine. For the first time, we laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing left to do. We started meeting once a week, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to walk. We didn't talk about Adrian or Brooke much anymore. We talked about work, our children, books we hadn't finished, the things we were learning to love again. It was strange how natural it felt, this friendship built from the ashes of betrayal. We didn't need to explain ourselves. There was a kind of peace in knowing someone else understood the silence between words. One evening, as we walked along the river, Daniel said, "You don't talk about revenge." I smiled, watching the reflection of the city lights ripple in the water. "Revenge was never the point," I said. "It was just the noise before the quiet." He nodded, understanding immediately. "That's what forgiveness is too," he murmured. "Not absolving them, just choosing peace for yourself." His words stayed with me long after we said goodnight. As the months passed, life settled into a new rhythm. I went back to work full-time, redecorated the apartment, bought a cat my daughter named Luna. There were bad days still, nights when I'd wake up from dreams of Adrian's face or hear a song that made me flinch. But healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to live with it without bleeding every time it's mentioned. Daniel and I kept in touch. Sometimes we'd talk daily, other times we'd go weeks without a word. But whenever he reached out, it felt easy. He wasn't trying to fix me, and I wasn't trying to fill a void. We were simply two people walking beside each other, not leaning, not clinging, just existing in parallel peace. One evening, after a particularly long day, I received a message from him. "Coffee tomorrow, or just quiet?" I replied. "Both sound perfect." That next morning, the city was alive with sunlight, the kind that makes even pain look softer. We sat at a small cafe with open windows and mismatched chairs. He ordered black coffee, I chose chai with honey. We talked about small things, nothing important, yet everything that mattered. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You seem lighter lately." I smiled. "I am." I stopped asking why me. Now I ask, what next? He nodded, his eyes warm. Maybe that's where healing begins, when the story stops being about them. After that day, I started noticing how often he made me laugh. Real laughter, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd felt that way. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet joy in having someone who saw me, not the scars. And one afternoon, as we walked past a row of cherry trees beginning to bloom again, he reached for my hand. It wasn't planned or dramatic. It was gentle, hesitant, like asking permission to start over. I didn't pull away. In that moment, I understood something simple yet profound. Love doesn't always return in the form of passion or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes back as peace. That night, as I stood by my window watching the city lights flicker, I whispered to the reflection staring back at me, "You made it." Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. For the first time in years, I wasn't someone's wife, or someone's victim, or someone's revenge. I was just Mara Bennett. Still healing, but alive. Beautifully, fiercely alive. Love didn't come back to me with fireworks. It came quietly, like sunlight slipping through half-open curtains, warm but patient, asking nothing in return. Daniel and I never talked about falling in love. There was no confession, no dramatic moment, no trembling lips whispering promises. It simply happened. One day, we were two people who had survived the same storm, and the next, we were walking through the calm together. Not out of need, but choice. He never tried to fix me, and I never tried to complete him. That was the beauty of it. We met as two whole people, scarred, yes, but whole in a way only those who've been broken can be. Sometimes on quiet evenings, we'd cook together in my small kitchen. He'd chop vegetables with ridiculous precision while I teased him for being too serious. He'd laugh, shake his head and say, "Old habits. When you've been through chaos, you crave order." I'd smile and reply, "Then maybe we're both learning to live in peace." There were moments, small, almost invisible, that told me love had returned. The way he'd pour my tea without asking how I liked it, because he already knew. The way his eyes softened when I spoke about my daughter. The way silence between us didn't demand to be filled. I used to think love was intensity, loud, consuming, like a fire that leaves nothing untouched. Now I knew it could be gentle too. Not a storm, but a steady rain that nurtures instead of destroys. One afternoon, we took a drive along the coast. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of salt and renewal. He played old songs from the radio, the kind that once hurt but now just hummed softly in the background. At one point, he pulled over near a cliff where the sea stretched endlessly below us. We stood there, side by side, watching waves crash against the rocks. Funny, he said quietly, how something can break over and over and still be beautiful. I turned to look at him. Like people, he smiled, and I saw in that smile everything we'd both fought for: peace, forgiveness, the courage to begin again. He reached for my hand, not with urgency, but with the steady assurance of someone who understood what it meant to lose. And I didn't hesitate. This time, I didn't fear what could go wrong. I trusted what was already right. We stood there for a long time, not saying a word. The wind played with my hair, the sea roared below, and the sky opened in a pale shimmer of gold. I realized then that love doesn't ask you to forget the past, it simply helps you make peace with it. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Daniel whispered, "We made it." I smiled, tears catching the last light of day. "Yes," I said softly, "we did." That night, back home, I opened the window and let the cool air fill the room. The world outside was still the same, imperfect, unpredictable, and painfully real. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had learned to rebuild, not from what was lost, but from what survived. And as I turned off the lights and lay beside him, his hand resting gently on mine, I finally understood. Sometimes, love doesn't come to rescue you. It comes to remind you that you already saved yourself. Years passed, but I didn't count them. When you stop living in survival mode, time begins to flow differently, softer, slower, no longer something to endure, but to inhabit. The apartment I once saw as temporary had turned into a home. There were books on every surface, mismatched mugs from morning coffees, and laughter echoing through the hallway again. The air no longer carried the weight of old memories. It carried the smell of cinnamon and salt, of life freshly lived. Daniel and I never married. Not because we didn't believe in commitment, but because we didn't need a ceremony to prove what was already true. We had already made vows in quieter ways, in the way he reached for my hand when my anxiety returned, in the way I stayed up with him through his sleepless nights when memories of betrayal crept back. We didn't promise forever. We simply lived today, fully, honestly, with gratitude for the peace we had both earned. Sometimes, when I caught our reflection in the mirror, two people a little older, a little scarred but still laughing, I thought about how far we had come. There was a time I believed my story had ended in that garage, with a small box and a broken heart. But life, I learned, doesn't end with heartbreak. It just pauses, waiting for you to decide whether to give up or grow through it. My daughter once asked, "Mom, do you ever miss Dad?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. Sometimes, I miss who I thought he was, but not the man he became. She nodded, thoughtful beyond her years, and said, "You're happier now." And she was right. Happiness doesn't always mean excitement. Sometimes it's the calm that comes after the storm, the kind that settles quietly in your bones and whispers, "You made it." One summer evening, Daniel and I took a trip back to the coast, the same place where we had once stood on that cliff, watching the ocean crash against the rocks. The air was warm, the sky painted in strokes of pink and gold. He set up a small blanket, unpacked sandwiches, and poured wine into plastic cups. I laughed. "Romantic as ever." He grinned, handing me a cup. "Simple is safer for us." We sat in silence for a while, watching the waves rise and fall. Time had softened everything, even the memories that once stung. Adrian and Brooke were just names now, echoes of a story that no longer belonged to us. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate is heavy, and I had carried enough weight for one lifetime. Daniel broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if none of it had?" I looked at him, smiling softly. "Then you and I would still be strangers," he nodded. "Maybe some storms are meant to bring people together. Or to wash away everything that isn't real," I added. The wind picked up, playing with my hair, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the exact same peace I had prayed for years ago. Not the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it. That was my healing. When we got home that night, the house glowed with the soft light of evening. The cat curled at the foot of the couch, the windows open to the hum of the city. Daniel went to make tea, humming an old song under his breath. And I sat by the window, notebook in hand, writing the last lines of a chapter that had taken me years to finish. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go isn't saying goodbye to someone else, it's forgiving yourself for staying too long, for believing too deeply, for loving without being loved back. But when you finally do, the world opens again. I closed the notebook and smiled. I had forgiven him, yes, but more importantly, I had forgiven myself. Daniel walked over, handing me a mug of tea. "What were you writing?" "Just the ending," I said. "Of what?" "Of everything." He laughed softly, sitting beside me. "Then let's start something new." We sat there, watching the city lights blink below us, two souls who had once been shattered, now whole again. Not because of love, but because of the courage to let love return without fear. That night, before turning off the lights, I whispered to the dark, "This time, I choose peace." And for once, there was no echo, no emptiness, only the quiet rhythm of two steady heartbeats, strong and synchronized. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't even an ending at all. It was life, real, flawed, gentle, and finally mine. It's been years since that day in the garage. The day the world cracked open and swallowed the version of you that believed love could never lie. I can still see you standing there, frozen, holding that little box as if it were a bomb ready to go off. You didn't know it yet, but that sound, that hollow thud when it hit the floor, wasn't the sound of your marriage ending. It was the sound of your awakening. You thought it was the end. You thought you'd never recover, that no amount of time could scrape the pain from your bones. You thought your life had been stolen from you, but it wasn't stolen, love. It was returned to your own hands after years of giving it away too freely. You were never weak for trusting. You were brave. It takes courage to love fully in a world that so often mistakes vulnerability for foolishness. You gave your heart in good faith, and that is something to be proud of, not ashamed. Yes, he betrayed you. Yes, you fell apart. But listen, falling apart was the best thing that ever happened to you. Because sometimes, it's the only way to rebuild yourself right. I remember the nights you cried without sound, afraid your children would hear. The way you stared into the mirror, unable to recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes swollen, her mouth trembling, her hands shaking as if the truth had a pulse of its own. You begged for answers that would never come. You searched for logic in a heart that had already decided to stop loving you. You wanted closure, but what you really needed was clarity. Closure depends on someone else. Clarity comes from within. And clarity was what finally set you free. I remember the rage too, that cold, controlled fury that burned clean through your tears. The moment you stopped being the woman who asked why and became the woman who said enough. When you took back your power, quietly, methodically, without apology. When you stopped waiting for justice and created your own. The world may have called it revenge, but I know the truth. It wasn't vengeance, it was reclamation. You weren't trying to destroy him. You were trying to save yourself. Do you remember what came next? The silence. Not the suffocating silence of loneliness, but a softer one. The kind that wrapped around you like a blanket after a long cry. You didn't know it yet, but that silence was healing you. It was teaching you how to breathe again, how to sit with your own company without shrinking inside it. You started reading again, books that reminded you of the woman you used to be before you became someone's wife, someone's shadow. You cooked meals for one and learned that solitude doesn't mean emptiness. You laughed again. Awkwardly at first, then louder, freer, until it filled the apartment like music. You discovered that strength wasn't loud. It wasn't about moving on quickly or pretending you were fine. Strength was showing up for yourself on the days you didn't want to. Strength was admitting that healing wasn't linear, that sometimes you'd bleed again from the same wound and still keep walking. Strength was forgiving yourself. For staying, for trying, for loving the wrong person for the right reasons. And then, one ordinary day, life gave you something extraordinary. A message, short, gentle, unexpected, from a man who understood pain in a language you didn't have to translate. Daniel Hawthorne. You didn't fall in love with him because he saved you. You fell in love because he didn't try to. He saw you, not as broken, but as rebuilding. He never asked for your pieces. He sat beside you while you put them back together yourself. He listened, he stayed, and slowly, without realizing it, so did you. He didn't come to fix what was broken. He came to prove that love could exist without possession, that touch could heal without demanding. With him, you learned what peace feels like in human form. You learned that love isn't supposed to make you small. It's supposed to make you soft again. Not fragile, just open. You learn that love can be quiet too, that it can walk beside you instead of consuming you, that it can look like morning coffee, shared laughter, hands brushing against each other without fear. You learn that sometimes the safest place in the world isn't a house or a marriage. It's a moment of truth shared between two souls who survived the same storm. Now, years later, you live in a home filled with light, not the kind from chandeliers or sunshine, but the kind that comes from peace of mind. You've stopped apologizing for your softness. You've stopped confusing love with sacrifice. You no longer need to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. And on nights when the world grows quiet and memories come uninvited, you no longer tremble. You smile, because you know everything that once broke you also built you. Every betrayal carved space for something more honest. Every ending became a bridge to a beginning you didn't see coming. So this is my letter to you, the woman I used to be. You did it. You survived what was meant to destroy you, and you did it with grace. You lost everything you thought mattered and found something far more precious: yourself. You learned that peace isn't given, it's created. That forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom. And that love, real love, doesn't need a fairy tale. It just needs truth. I hope you're proud of yourself, because I am. And if one day another woman finds herself standing in her own garage, holding her own heartbreak, I hope she finds your story. I hope she sees that pain doesn't have to be the end. That she can fall apart and still rise softer, wiser, stronger. That she can learn, as you did, that the quiet kind of forever begins the moment she chooses herself. With love, the woman you became.